On June 10th, in June of 2010, it appears that Keating is first put on monitoring 3 years after the family of this girl is told he would be. Do you have any reason to dispute that?
I don't have any specific memory about when this began.
And that he was...
Could I mention just one brief thing, if I could?
You may.
That the review board would make its recommendations to the Archbishop, and my job was to see to the implementation of the Archbishop's directive. It may be that the review board information went to the Archbishop's office and then was communicated to me sometime after, and that Archbishop Nienstedt did not know that it had not been communicated to me. There was a transitional period there.
Well, the Archbishop doesn't have to follow the review board recommendations.
That's correct.
It's
which is
simply an advisory board.
That's correct, which is why I'm saying I may have been aware, it's possible, I don't have any memory of this, but it's possible that I was aware the review board recommended some forms of monitoring, that went to Archbishop Flynn, perhaps, and then did not get disposed of timely, and only sometime later did Archbishop Nienstedt say, hey, what's going on with this? I don't know that.
You had mentioned Father Timothy McCarthy earlier. I'm going to ask you about that. Are you aware that there are allegations of sexual abuse of 2 minor boys made to the Archdiocese in 1982?
I knew it was in the 80s. I did not know when.
Were you aware that he was forced to resign as a priest in 1991?
Yes, I'm very proud of that. I lobbied heavily for that to happen.
Were you aware that he later worked at the Hennepin County Juvenile Detention Facility?
I was. When I learned it, I called the Hennepin County people and said, you appear never to have done a background check on this man with us.
So you warned him?
Yes. Once I found out that he was there.
And he was still a priest at that time, wasn't he?
No, well, he had left the priesthood many years before. He left when we drove him out in 1991. We removed his faculties and he was no longer permitted to work as a priest.
No longer continued to work as a priest is different than continuing to be a priest, however.
I thought we might, do you want to talk about that for a little bit?
Well, you know, I think there is a difference, isn't there? I mean,
well,
somebody can be a priest and no longer have faculties, correct?
Right.
Okay.
Someone, let me just mention, however, a person who's laicized is still a priest.
Well,
a person who is removed from the clerical state, or sometimes called reduced to the lay state, is in our sacramental theology still a priest. So the removal of faculties is the decisive intervention.
let's talk about Gil Gustason for a moment. I know we referred to him, but he abused a number of children and was convicted in 1983, correct?
I'll accept that that's the date. I don't recall the specific date, but that sounds right.
In the 80s and 90s, he was working at the Chancery, and one of his duties was to work with you on child sex abuse cases.
No, he actually worked in a variety of administrative tasks. I don't think he worked on sex abuse cases.
Was he ever put on monitoring?
He was eventually, yes.
It's reported that he had moved into a consulting position with Cristo Rey High School, a Jesuit high school. Did you become aware of that?
I think I've heard of that very recently. He moved into a consulting position with a company, with a friend of his named Greg. I don't recall Greg's last name. I'm sure that's there somewhere. And it may be that Greg's company was hired to assist Cristo Rey.
Did you know that company was working with schools, parishes, and the Archdiocese?
I wasn't aware the company worked with the Archdiocese. I was aware that it worked with some parishes, yes.
Well, does it concern you now to hear that?
It doesn't concern me much because, of course, Gustason was the poster priest for this. His issues were very, very widely known.
So you think the people at Cristo Rey and the other parishes know what you know about that?
Yes.
In fact, there had been a confidential settlement made where confidentiality was completely required in the first case brought against Gustason, for which he was convicted in the early 80s, correct?
I don't recall. Of course, I was not in the chancery at that time.
Well, did you become aware that a settlement had been made, $20,000 paid to Brian Herity, but he was required by the Archdiocese to keep that absolutely confidential so that he nor anybody else in his family could tell? Did you know that?
Do you have a document that says that?
Well, I think I learned that sometime in the 90s or the early 2000s, perhaps in a press report.
Lee Krautkramer had been mentioned earlier. Did you become aware that abuse had been reported by him to the Archdiocese in the 1980s?
Yes.
And that he had been moved to another parish after that?
Was it he moved to another parish, or was he removed from a parish and put into hospital chaplaincy? I don't recall that specific.
The information I have is that after the report was made, he was moved to another parish, but the family was told that he wouldn't be around children.
Okay.
Do you
That antedated, although I was on the books as an official of the Archdiocese, I believe all that happened while I was away in graduate school, so I don't have those details.
Did you become aware in 1987 that a doctor that had seen Krautkramer believed that Krautkramer most likely will reoffend?
That comes as news to me even now.
Krautkramer was, and I think it sounds like you do know this, allowed to work as a chaplain at North Memorial Hospital and also do help out supply work after that until 2002.
That's correct, yes. I think that's under the rubric we talked about earlier. Are we close to that one final 15-minute break?
Sure, anytime.
Why don't we do that, and
Let's
then
do
we'll
it.
make the big push to the end?
Sure.
Back on the video record at 4:24 p.m.
Father, one of the things you had been talking earlier about is making disclosures to parishes of histories, at least known to the Archdiocese. It would be correct to say that when and if you made such a disclosure about a history of a known offender to a parish, that it would be your practice to document in the file that you made such a disclosure.
I think generally so, yes.
What do you mean generally so? Why wouldn't you document such a thing? Is that important?
No, generally it's important. I just don't know that in every case, say if one of the auxiliary bishops went out and held a meeting, they were often strapped for time and they may not have done such a disclosure. I'm thinking of the 1990s in particular. I believe I would have always produced some sort of memorialization.
Any disclosure you were involved in, you would have documented. That was your practice.
That was my practice.
And that would be the safest
Did I
thing to
fail
do.
in my practice once or twice? Quite probably, but yes, that was my practice.
I'd like to ask you about a priest who's been fairly recently publicly disclosed as having offended, and that'd be Gallatin. Tell us what you learned and when you learned it first about him having abused.
Right. So I don't think it's accurate to say that he offended or abused. As a matter of fact, I think that's quite an inaccurate characterization. Sometime around 2000, I don't recall the exact time, I received a phone call from a dad who said that while on a mission trip, Gallatin had placed his hand on the chest of his sleeping, I think, 17-year-old son. I asked the dad, I believe this would be memorialized, but I asked the dad, did he report it to the authorities in the place in the mission trip, which I think was either in Tennessee or Kentucky, I don't recall exactly. And he said that he had, and that he was told that it was not a matter that they would deal with. So.
Do you think it was Virginia?
Somewhere in the South, sorry.
Was any effort made by you or anybody else to find out the son's account of actually what did happen, instead of relying upon what was told by the father?
By the dad, I don't recall.
And so this was characterized then in the public disclosure and public statement made as a boundary violation where no crime had occurred, correct?
That's how I would still think of it today, so yes.
So what effort did you make or others from the Archdiocese to find out what he actually had done and to whom and when he had done it?
What
Gallatin
Gallatin had
interviewed?
done? Yes, we interviewed Gallatin, I interviewed the dad.
And Gallatin denied having engaged in any sexual contact, didn't he?
That's correct.
And Gallatin's account conflicted with the account given by the dad, didn't it?
That's not my recollection.
Was it consistent with the account given by the dad?
That is my recollection, but it's a long time ago now.
Any other interviews or investigation done to determine the real risk or what Gallatin had done, both in this instance or any other?
So then the assessment of risk came by asking him to undergo a psychological assessment.
And that was done by whom?
I don't recall that.
And did you review that assessment?
I'm sure I did. I don't recall it.
And you don't remember who did it? And do you remember when it was done?
I don't recall who did it. I think it was done immediately thereafter, but I don't recall when.
Do you know if the assessment included any recitation of Gallatin's sexual history as it pertains to youth?
I don't recall that.
Well, what do you recall then, if a determination was made that he was fit to minister? What do you recall about the assessment?
My recollection is that the assessor or assessors said that this was a man, again, rather emotionally tightly wound. Of course, I don't have the words in front of me, so this is my impression years later. Emotionally tightly wound, probably wrestling in his own mind with same-sex attractions, and that he ought to enter into therapy to help him come to a full acceptance of himself.
Do you recall that it was done by a Dr. Barron?
That wouldn't surprise me.
Do you recall that he had a reported attraction to sexual males? A reported attraction to teenage males?
I don't remember that, no. I do recall attraction to males. I don't recall teenage males.
Did Gallatin admit to you that he had touched the youth for his own sexual needs?
He did not admit it was for his own sexual needs, but he did admit that he had touched the youth for some sense of physical contact.
Which inferentially is sexual, correct?
Not necessarily.
So this is an adult priest touching a boy who's sleeping on the chest. and admitting that it's for some physical need, what beyond sexual can you suggest was being satisfied?
Right. I looked to the assessor, whoever that was, to help us understand what was going on.
Did you make the determination in allowing him to continue in ministry unrestricted and undisclosed that he had posed no risk or danger to the public?
Made the determination that he would continue in ministry unrestricted but not undisclosed, and yes, because he constituted no danger to the public.
And he was only publicly disclosed on December 29th, 2013, even though this is information that had been known to the Archdiocese since 1998.
I don't think that's true. I mean, he was publicly disclosed in the sense that he was outed in the newspapers or the media. He was disclosed, this history was disclosed in at least one of his ministry settings at the recommendation of the review board and the order of the Archbishop several years ago. I don't recall exactly when it was. I met with the trustees at the parish and said, here's the history, and I believe we also talked to the professional staff, and I asked them to give me their own assessment of how he related to people, and then also to recommend whatever further disclosure might be useful. Now that was at the place he was pastor, and I believe that we did something similar at the previous place he worked, but I don't recall that.
He was actually, is his status one of credibly accused now?
I don't know what they're calling it now.
When did you first learn that Mark Wayman is somebody that you had mentioned earlier had abused and had been accused of having abused minors?
To my knowledge, he's never been accused of having abused minors. In 2 cases, he was accused of showing untoward, undisciplined attention toward minors, which raised concerns. And I've intervened directly in the first matter, and that's the one that I called the South St. Paul police about.
Okay, tell me the first time you got information that raised red flags about Wayman.
I don't recall the year. The record will show it. It must have been, it was within a year or 2 of his ordination. He was an associate pastor in South St. Paul. I had a call from perhaps even the principal of the school saying that he was at a basketball game and sitting with a group of young people, and while there had rubbed the forearm of, or this is the forearm, rubbed the, what do we call this?
Upper arm.
The upper arm of one of the 8th graders, and that this seemed untoward to the parent who went to the principal.
What investigation was done responsive to that report?
I called the South St. Paul police and asked them to take a look at it.
How long ago was this?
It was a year or 2 after his ordination, so I'm guessing this is in around 2000 or 2001, but that's pure, the record would show when it is. I don't know when it was.
And he was continued in ministry?
That's right.
And any other red flags and or reports made?
A year or 2 later, a teacher at this parish that he went to for his second assignment as associate pastor said that he seemed to spend more time, this by now is certainly after all the negative publicity with the charter, the negative publicity about priests, and this teacher wondered, this is my recollection, wondered why this priest showed such enthusiasm for the young people. In that case, I said, I don't want to know the details myself, call the police and have the police take your statement and report it.
Because he's a priest in ministry, you had the power, as did the Archbishop, to call him in and ask him exactly what he had done to whom and when, correct?
That's right.
And did you do that?
I did after the police finally told us there's nothing here.
And what police agency or officer told you that?
That was, I got that through the then Chancellor. I think it was Bill Fallon again, so this is sometime in the first half of the 2000s. And I don't recall, I knew the name of the police officer at the time, or the investigator at the time, but I don't recall it now. That would all be documented.
Well, there's a difference between the police making a decision not to charge and there being no evidence of a crime being committed. You would agree with that, correct?
I'm not sure that that's, you mentioned a case earlier, the police may believe that a crime happened before, so long ago that the statute would not run. This, of course, was almost absolutely contemporaneous.
Well, what I'm trying to get at is what information was actually communicated to the Archdiocese and ultimately you about the reason he wasn't charged. And can you tell me what the reason was he wasn't charged with a crime against a youth when investigated by them?
I can't tell you that. The record would show it, I presume.
And when you use the term being told by Fallon there's nothing here, that's your term, isn't it?
That's correct.
Any other red flags or reports?
I believe that's it.
Did you become concerned that there was a pattern of conduct towards youth in the case of Wayman that merited more attention than was given it?
I became concerned that in a time of heightened sensitivity about children, that this man was showing a kind of a 1950s enthusiasm for children that simply was imprudent.
And wasn't that, in both your experience around this, also some kind of reflection of a denial by him of the gravity of his interest in youth and reflective of a possible greater risk than what he's disclosing?
Well, again, in terms of greater risk, in both cases, we had the public authorities assessing. I had a conversation with the South St. Paul police sergeant, I believe, that would be documented, who said, this guy didn't commit a crime, but he's stupid to be acting like this in a time when there's so much sensitivity. So my concern was about his own prudent judgment about the perception of his behavior.
Did you give instructions to Wayman after having learned that to stop the behavior and the interest expressed in the youth that he had demonstrated?
I believe I did, yes.
Did you document that?
Probably. That would be in the file.
Do you have a memory of having done so?
I have a memory of documenting the visit to the South St. Paul police. That was a rather vivid meeting, as I recall. And and I recall documenting that. I don't recall what was in the various forms of documentation.
You're on the board of directors of the Minnesota Catholic Conference, aren't you?
No.
Have you ever been?
No.
Oh. The Catholic, do you participate in the bishops' Minnesota Catholic Conference meetings?
I've been asked by them to come to speak to them, yes.
Have you spoken to them on statute of limitations reform and how to keep it from being passed into law?
I've spoken about how we might act so that the reform would be reasonable and not unreasonable.
Well, you acted.
310000000.
Sure. You acted pretty vigorously while you were chaplain to make sure that didn't gain any ground in the legislature, didn't you?
Actually, I acted very vigorously for a lot of years, but took a hiatus while I was chaplain.
You testified when you were chaplain.
I don't recall. I may have in the House. I may have testified in the House.
It's testifying is pretty vigorous lobbying against, isn't it?
Well, I was Senate chaplain and followed the instructions of the Senate Majority Leader in regard to what and whom I ought to talk to and about what.
And the Minnesota Religious Council was formed specifically to fund, finance, and prevent legislative reform pertaining to the statute of limitations.
And other similar matters, changes in torts.
But
This is an issue about which you and I, of course, have some very profound
yeah,
disagreements.
and some real history. So, I mean, we also know that originally was formed after the law was passed in 1989 and 90 that opened up the window, and a decision was made by the Archdiocese to fund and create the Religious Council to prevent statute of limitations reform.
The Archdiocese and others agreed to fund efforts to monitor and to try to make reasonable changes in regard to statute limitations and other related matters.
And that funding has been tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, most of which has come from the coffers of the Archdiocese.
Yes and yes.
Do you believe, Father, that a priest who admits to a sexual attraction to minors should be allowed to work in a parish?
I'd have a difficult time seeing that as prudent.
It was made quite public that there was some kind of allegation made against Archbishop Nienstedt that caused him to kind of step down temporarily. And obviously, we know that he no longer is in a position where he stepped down. And that was fairly recent. When in time did it become known to you and other officials of the Archdiocese that accusation actually had been made?
I can't speak to the other, to any other officials of the Archdiocese.
What about you?
I have a privileged relationship with a person who received the information and had been advised that he ought to report it, and I seconded that advice to him.
There is staff report that was known to the Archdiocese staff and some in it in 2009 or 10.
That could be
Do you
so.
dispute
I'm
that?
not. I have no information one way or the other to go with that.
But it was never made public until recently.
Again, I don't have any information. I don't have any information on it.
When did you get the information? When in time? What year?
Remember here, I'm signaling to you.
I
This is privileged.
don't need the privilege part. I'm just talking
This
about the when.
privileged. Yeah.
When
Will that
in time?
review-
This will not revoke the privilege to
All right.
answer the question. Sometime in the 24 hours or so before the report was made. Okay,
When you talk about the report to law enforcement.
correct.
Okay. And did you have any information about that or anything like that before that point in time?
I did not.
There is a document called the Crimens Solicitationes, or Crimes of Solicitation. It is now well known that there's a 1922 version and a 1962 version of that document. That means it's a crime to engage in solicitation in the confessional, and a decree from the Vatican that it is a crime and that clerics are to act in a certain way when known. When did you become familiar with such a decree?
I did doctoral studies in the field in Rome, and I believe the document was never mentioned in that context. I believe I first learned of the existence of the document sometime in the 1990s.
And was that a document that was largely, how did you learn that?
I believe at a canon law convention.
Was that basically a decree then that was kept largely known by the canon lawyers and those that they were advising, largely the ordinaries?
Perhaps useful to explain. I always knew, because I'd been trained as a young priest, and by the way, I trained the children indirectly about this at St. Peter Claver at Incarnation, that there are very important rules about the confessional. So this is part of the common knowledge among Catholics. I believe the Crimini Sollicitudo, I'm having the same problem you were, was about the procedure for reporting to the appropriate congregation in Rome. Yes.
And that procedure was largely to keep it a secret procedure because of the gravity of the crime, and to handle it in secrecy and to get it to the Vatican to be handled. Is that?
Yes, and particularly because what's involved is the seal of the confessional. The issue is about the seal of the confessional.
And also the gravity of it, the seriousness of it, when a priest uses the confessional to solicit, and the known harm done, correct?
Can I say honestly, I don't think that in either 1922 or 1961 anybody had a sense of the harm. I'm sorry to say that. I believe in my training as a seminarian, never mind as a canon lawyer, the question of the seal of the confessional was an absolute top flight concern, and this is a matter that touches on that.